The morning mist clung to the hillsides like a lingering whisper, heavy and damp over the rocky foothills of Colorado. Behind the small log cabin, Rebecca Stone knelt on the cold earth, hands working through the soil, tugging at stubborn weeds that refused to loosen their hold. Her faded brown dress hung loosely, worn from years of use, and a single ribbon, frayed at the edges, held her auburn hair in a simple braid that trailed down her back. She was young, just 23, but the weight of the world already seemed to live in her deep green eyes. Her father's cough rattled the walls from inside, the sound a constant reminder of his failing health and years of chasing gold dust that never brought the fortune he had hoped for. The letters sat on the table by the fire, thin, impersonal things filled with dates and threats from Denver that Rebecca understood too well. Her younger brother and sister played barefoot in the rocks outside, unaware of the storm that brewed in every letter. They laughed as if the world could not touch them, their innocence, a sharp contrast to the shadows that seemed to follow Rebecca everywhere. That evening, the wind pushed against the shutters with a mournful howl. The small fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth fighting the chill that crept through the cracks in the walls. Rebecca sat by the fire, mending the torn sleeve of a shirt with steady hands. Her father slumped in his chair, staring into the flames. After what felt like hours of silence, he finally spoke. "I can't work the claim much longer, Rebecca," he said, his voice strained with effort. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one harder than the last. "The bank won't wait, and I won't last through the winter. You'll need to marry someone who can provide, someone strong, someone who can carry us all through the storm." Rebecca's hands paused, but she didn't look up. She kept her fingers moving, carefully stitching the fabric as her heart clenched. She didn't want to be sold like this, forced into a marriage out of duty. She had dreamed of love, of making her own choices. But looking at her father's frail form, she knew he couldn't survive this fight alone. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his shoulders hunched with the weight of his own failure. "I never meant for it to fall on you." Rebecca's eyes stung, but she blinked the tears away, focusing on the task in her hands. She couldn't afford the luxury of tears, not tonight. When her family slept, she sat at the rough table, a borrowed book open before her, a book filled with stories of cities far away, of trains that cut through mountains and iron roads that promised a different life. For a few moments, the stories made the cabin feel a little less small, a little less suffocating. She imagined a life where she was more than just the daughter of a miner. A firm knock on the door broke the silence. It wasn't the gentle tap of a visitor. It was steady, confident, as if the man outside knew exactly why he stood there. Rebecca's father rose with difficulty, his hand finding the rifle by the door. When he opened it, a man stood in the moonlight, his broad figure outlined by the silver glow. His dark beard was dusted with frost, and the cold air clung to his worn leather coat. "Caleb Walker," the man said as he stepped inside, removing his hat with a fluid motion. His calm blue eyes scanned the room, meeting Rebecca's for just a moment before settling on her father. "I've heard about your troubles." The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke plainly, without frills, telling them he was a mountain man with land higher up in the range. He was no gold miner, he said, but he had steady work, strong hands, and a place of his own. If Rebecca chose to be his wife, he would settle their debts and ensure they had enough food and wood to last through the winter. The cabin went quiet. Rebecca's brother and sister stopped playing and climbed onto the ladder to watch, their wide eyes blinking in the dim light. Her father's coughing fit bent him double, and he leaned heavily on the table. When he asked Caleb what he really wanted, the man's answer was just as steady. "I need a partner," Caleb said. "Not a doll, a woman who can stand beside me when the storms come. I've seen you, Rebecca, hauling sacks in town, keeping your family together when everything was against you. I think you're stronger than this valley ever gives you credit for. But if you choose this, I won't drag you away. The choice is yours." He tipped his hat again and stepped back into the cold night, leaving Rebecca with a question that lingered in the air long after the door had closed. For the next few days, Pine Ridge buzzed with gossip. Women whispered about the poor girl the mountain man wanted to marry, and the men at the trading post muttered about Caleb's offer. wondering if there was something he was hiding. Rebecca heard it all. She listened, silently counting her coins as she bought flour and salt, and at night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with doubt. Caleb came by once more at dusk, sitting quietly on the porch rail as the sky darkened to a deep blue. He didn't ask her for an answer. Instead, he spoke of the high country, of the snow that could cover everything, of clear streams that ran through untouched valleys. He talked about the world changing, about railroads cutting through the land, and how people could either learn to ride with the change or let it crush them. 2 days later, the creditors arrived. They wore neat coats and rode clean horses, and their voices were flat and businesslike as they discussed the money owed and threatened to take the claim, the cabin, and even the mule if payment wasn't made soon. When they left, dust settled in the yard, and her father sank into the chair as if the weight of his failure had finally broken him. That night, he spoke the truth Rebecca had been avoiding. "Caleb's offer may be our only chance," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Without help, the bank will take everything, and your brother and sister may be sent away. I'm sorry. I never wanted to make you carry this." Rebecca stood in the loft that night, her hands on the edge of the cracked mirror, staring at the woman who faced her. She was no longer the girl who dreamed of distant cities and iron railroads. She was a woman who had to choose, and every path she imagined led back to the same hard truth. When the sun rose the next morning, the peaks turned pale gold beneath a cold sky. As Rebecca stepped onto the porch, Caleb stood waiting, a small wagon behind him, stacked with sacks and crates. 2 horses stood nearby, their breath steaming in the morning air. Her family watched from the doorway, their faces tight with worry. She stood between them, heart torn, with one foot in the past and the other in an uncertain future. Fear gripped her, but a thin, bright line of hope tugged her toward Caleb and the unknown. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice low but steady. Caleb nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of the choice that would change both their lives. As the wagon rumbled away from the cabin, the land stretched out before them. The mountains rose higher, colder, the trees pressing in like silent sentinels. And as the town of Pine Ridge faded from sight, Rebecca could feel the weight of the unknown ahead, the secret of Caleb's life that she had yet to uncover. The trail climbed steadily, the narrow path winding between jagged rocks and thick stands of pine. Every breath Rebecca took felt sharp in her lungs, the air thinning as they ascended higher into the mountains. The land seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching for miles, broken only by the crunch of wagon wheels over gravel and the soft stamping of the horses' hooves. Rebecca clutched her shawl tighter, the cold biting at her skin as they passed through thick forest, the dark trunks of the trees looming like silent watchers. The wagon creaked and groaned under the weight of their supplies, Caleb steady at the reins. He said little as they traveled, his eyes always scanning the landscape, his movements sure and practiced. His coat, though worn and patched, fit him well, and his boots were sturdy, polished by the long miles of his life in the high country. Rebecca studied him as they rode, her mind heavy with questions. She had married him for the sake of her family, out of duty, and the hope that this man, whom she hardly knew, could provide a better life. But as the miles stretched on, she couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. She had trusted him, chosen him, and now the reality of that choice pressed in on her like the narrow path they followed. The days blurred together. The land grew steeper, the air colder, and the trees more sparse. At times, they stopped beside a small creek to rest the horses, Caleb effortlessly building a fire, his movements fluid and precise. Rebecca sat quietly by the fire, her hands wrapped around a small loaf of bread, watching him work. He was not what she had imagined, a rough mountain man with calloused hands in an empty cabin, but something about him was different. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, a steadiness that spoke of more than just survival. She thought back to the cabin, to the garden she had tended with such care, to the children laughing, unaware of the choices she had made for them. The life she had known was slipping further behind her with every mile, and ahead, The unknown stretched into a vast silence that both terrified and intrigued her. On the third morning, they broke through the trees and into a wide, open valley. The wind had picked up, snapping at Rebecca's shawl as she pulled it tighter around her shoulders. The sky was dark with clouds, and the air smelled of snow. The horses tugged at the reins, eager to press on, but Caleb reined them in. "Rest here," he said quietly. "The roughest part of the road is behind us." Rebecca glanced at the narrow pass ahead. It was hard to believe anything could be more difficult than the journey they had already endured. But there was something in Caleb's voice that made her pause. She set her gaze on the distant hills, her mind wandering to the promise he had made. The promise that she would always have a choice. But what choice did she have now? She was so far from everything she had known, from everything she had dreamed. She was already too far in. Caleb's voice broke her thoughts. "The next part of the journey will be different. You'll see." Rebecca didn't ask him to explain. She wasn't sure she wanted to know just yet. She needed time to understand the man she had married, to understand what lay beyond the mountains and the life she had left behind. They continued on, the road now a rougher track, winding through rocky outcrops and thickets of brush. The wind howled in the trees, sending branches creaking and swaying. Caleb drove the wagon with practiced ease, never once seeming troubled by the challenges the land presented. His calmness, his silent strength, had a way of grounding her, but it also left her with more questions. The trail finally opened up onto a small plateau. Below, nestled between two ridges, lay a wide valley, and in the heart of it stood a massive lodge. The dark wooden structure was built of thick logs, the roof sloping sharply toward the ground. Tall windows gleamed in the low light, and smoke billowed from chimneys on either side. Outbuildings spread across the valley, the neat lines of fences and barns, visible even from this distance. It was a place of power, a place of wealth. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She had expected a small cabin, a simple life in the mountains, but this was something else entirely. This was no home for a poor mountain man. Her breath caught in her throat as they drew closer. The valley was pristine, untouched by the hands of outsiders, and the lodge seemed to rise from the earth itself, as though it had always been there, hidden from the world. Caleb slowed the wagon, guiding the horses down a narrow track that led toward the main entrance. Rebecca could hardly believe her eyes. As they pulled up to the front steps, a tall man emerged from the lodge, his movements calm and assured. He was dressed in fine, though simple, clothes, his boots polished, and his hair neatly combed. He greeted Caleb by name, his voice warm but formal, as if he had been expecting them. "Everything's ready inside," the man said with a nod, stepping aside as Caleb helped Rebecca down from the wagon. Rebecca's mind raced, and a feeling of unease settled deep in her chest. This wasn't the home of a poor mountain man, no matter how steady Caleb's hands had seemed. This was a place of wealth and power, a place that belonged to someone who had built it from the ground up, and Caleb had never told her. Caleb turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "This is Winterhouse," he said, his voice low. "It's mine. And now it's yours, too." Quote. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. The words hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. She had married a man she believed was struggling, just like her father, a man who had offered her a life of simple survival. But this was something else. She had stepped into a world far different from the one she had imagined. Before she could speak, Caleb placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "I didn't want you to come here under false pretenses," he said quietly. "But now you know the truth. I didn't ask you to marry me for this. I asked because I needed a partner, someone who could stand beside me when the world tries to tear everything apart." Rebecca swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. She had no words to respond. The valley spread out before her, quiet and secret, like something from a story she had never believed could be real. The great doors of Winterhouse creaked open, revealing a vast hall bathed in the warm glow of lamplight. The air smelled of cedar and fresh bread, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Rebecca stepped inside, her boots muffled by the thick rugs that covered the polished wooden floors. The walls were adorned with paintings of mountains and forests, landscapes she had once only seen in books. The fire crackled in the stone hearth at the far end of the room, casting long shadows across the high ceilings. Everything here seemed larger than life, too grand for someone like her, too fine for a woman who had grown up with her hands in the dirt and her skin weathered by the sun. She hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to cross the threshold into a world so different from the one she had known. Her heart beat a little faster, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to steady herself. Caleb, ever the steady presence, stepped inside ahead of her. He removed his worn coat and hung it on a wooden rack near the door, the motion smooth and practiced. There was something almost regal about the way he moved, even in the simplest of actions. He turned back to her, his eyes soft but full of unspoken things. "This is your home now, too," he said, his voice low but steady. "I know it's a lot to take in." Rebecca nodded, but the words caught in her throat. This was not the life she had expected. It was nothing like the cabin she had left behind, nothing like the life she had promised to her family. This place, this lodge, felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Is it really yours?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question was raw, the doubt slipping out before she could mask it with politeness. Caleb paused, then turned to face her fully. "Yes," he said, his voice unflinching. "Winterhouse and everything around it. My father built it, and now it's mine. But you're here because I chose you, not for what I have, but for who you are." Rebecca swallowed, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had married a man who had promised stability, a life away from the crushing debts of her father. But this place had the feeling of something much larger than she had bargained for. A soft noise behind her made her turn. A woman stood in the doorway, her apron crisp and neat, her dark eyes full of silent curiosity. "Dinner will be served soon, Mrs. Winters," the woman said with a polite nod, her tone professional but distant. Rebecca blinked, the title unfamiliar on her ears. Mrs. Winters. She had barely come to terms with the fact that she had married Caleb, but now she was expected to take on this new role, a lady of Winterhouse, a woman whose very presence seemed out of place in such grandeur. "Thank you," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the storm of thought swirling in her head. As the woman left, Caleb gestured toward the staircase. "The rooms are upstairs. Take your time to settle in." Rebecca nodded, but her feet felt heavy as she followed him up the stairs, each step carrying her further away from everything she had known. The grand hallways were lined with dark wood, and the thick carpets muffled her footsteps. Caleb stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway, turning to face her. "This is where you'll sleep," he said softly, pushing the door open to reveal a large, well-appointed room. The bed was massive, the covers a deep crimson, and the fireplace on the far wall flickered with a comforting warmth. Rebecca stepped inside, her heart beating wildly. She had never imagined a room like this, never dreamed that something so luxurious could be hers. It was beautiful, but it also felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. "You can rest for now," Caleb said, his voice low. "I'll be downstairs if you need me." Quote. He turned to leave, but Rebecca stopped him with a quiet question. "Why didn't you tell me about all of this? About Winterhouse, about what you really have?" Quote. Caleb hesitated at the door, his expression guarded. "I didn't want you to choose me because of what I own," he said, his voice rough. "I needed someone who saw me for who I am, not just the man with the land and the timber. I wanted you to choose me because of what we could build together." Rebecca stared at him, his words hanging in the air like the smoke from the fire. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the man she had married had not hidden his wealth as some sort of trick. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Caleb than he had let on. He met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. "I never meant to deceive you, Rebecca," he added quietly. "But now that you know the truth, you have a choice to make. You can leave if you want, or you can stay. But whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Quote. Rebecca stood still for a long moment, her heart torn. She had made her choice, to marry him for the sake of her family, to help them survive. But now, standing in this opulent room, she wasn't sure what her heart truly wanted. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice steady, though the uncertainty still lingered in her chest. "But I need to understand what this all means." Caleb nodded once, the lines of his face softening just slightly. "You'll understand in time," he said. "In the meantime, let's start with dinner." Later that evening, as they sat at a long wooden table in the great hall, Rebecca felt the weight of Caleb's silence beside her. The servants moved gracefully around them, bringing out dishes she had never seen before: roast meats, freshly baked bread, and rich stews. The warmth of the fire and the heavy scent of food filled the room, but it didn't ease the tension that hung between them. As Caleb ate, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant, as if his mind were still in the mountains, still tracking some invisible threat. Rebecca, too, was lost in her thoughts. The questions about Caleb's past, his wealth, his hidden life, all of it churned inside her like the storm she had left behind. When the meal ended, Caleb excused himself to attend to matters in the lodge, leaving Rebecca alone by the fire. She leaned back in her chair, the crackling warmth of the hearth failing to thaw the cold that had settled in her heart. The reality of her decision was sinking in. She had married a man who held a hidden kingdom in the mountains, a man who had chosen her not for her beauty, not for her family's wealth, but for something else. The life she had known, the life she had left behind, seemed so far away now, like a story from another time, one she would never return to. The fire flickered and popped, and Rebecca sat alone, lost in the quiet hum of the world Caleb had led her into, a world where she was no longer just the daughter of a miner, but the wife of a man whose secrets were as deep as the mountains themselves. The days in Winterhouse passed in a haze of newness. Rebecca wandered the grand halls of the lodge, her fingers brushing against the polished banisters, her footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. Caleb's world was large, too large for her to truly grasp all at once, and every corner seemed to hold some new discovery, each room grander than the last, each window offering views of the distant peaks she had climbed only days before. But for all the beauty and comfort, a heavy stillness pressed in around her, a feeling that settled deep in her chest as she looked out across the valley. The lodge was quiet, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the thick walls. The silence here was different from the quiet of the mountains. This was a silence of secrets, of things left unspoken. Caleb kept to his routines as he always had. He rose early, disappearing into the cold morning before Rebecca could join him. He returned only at dusk, often bringing with him reports of the timber business or the goings-on at the mill. His hands were always busy, either with papers or with the land, but never with her. It was hard to ignore the distance between them, the gap that had grown with every passing day. He had promised her partnership, but instead she felt like a guest in his home, a stranger in his life. Caleb had brought her here under the guise of marriage, but now it seemed that he was just as distant as he had been when she first met him. One afternoon, after another long day spent wandering the lodge's labyrinth of rooms, Rebecca found herself standing before the great windows that overlooked the valley. The view was breathtaking, the sunlight casting long shadows across the meadow below, where a herd of cattle grazed lazily. The valley was peaceful, too peaceful for the turmoil she felt inside. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the wind stir the trees below. The lodge was beautiful, yes, but it was not home. Her home was in the mountains, in the cabin where her family had struggled, where every day had been a battle for survival. This life felt too distant, too removed from the real world. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts, and she turned to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow. His eyes were tired, his face set in a way that suggested 1,000 unspoken words. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative. Rebecca didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the window, her eyes searching the valley as though she could find the answers hidden in the land below. "I don't belong here, Caleb," she said quietly, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "I never asked for this life. I never asked to be your wife, living in this place, far from everything I've ever known." The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Caleb didn't speak at first, his eyes studying her from across the room, but Rebecca could feel the weight of his gaze. He stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if afraid of what he might hear. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "I didn't bring you here to trap you, Rebecca. I brought you here because I thought you could build something with me. You've always been strong, always taken care of your family. I thought you could help me do the same. Help me make Winter Ridge a place that's not just about timber and land, but about something that lasts." Rebecca turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I didn't ask for any of this," she said, the frustration rising in her voice. "I didn't ask to be part of this world, Caleb. I didn't ask to leave everything behind and come to a place that doesn't feel like home." Quote. Caleb stepped closer, his expression softening. "I know you didn't ask for this, but I thought you saw something in me, something worth standing beside. I didn't want you to choose me because of what I had, but because of who I am." Rebecca shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know who you are anymore," she whispered. "All I see is the man who owns this place, the man who holds everything together with his wealth and his power. But where are you, Caleb? Where is the man who promised me that we would face everything together?" Quote. The words hung between them like a weight neither could ignore. Caleb's eyes faltered for a moment, his face tight with something Rebecca couldn't quite place. He opened his mouth to speak, but she stopped him with a simple gesture. "I don't want promises anymore," she said, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. "I want to know who you really are. I want to know why you chose me, why you brought me here, and why you've kept me at arm's length since we arrived." There was a long pause, and for a moment Rebecca thought Caleb might walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the distance between them, his gaze steady and direct. He reached for her hand, his grip warm, though his fingers were rough. "You deserve more than just answers, Rebecca," he said quietly. "You deserve the truth, the whole truth." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, heavy, with the weight of everything left unsaid. Finally, Caleb exhaled a deep breath, as if making a decision. "You want to know who I am?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I'm a man who inherited more than just land and timber. I inherited the weight of a legacy that's been building for generations. My father built Winterhouse, built everything you see here. But it came at a cost. The weight of what's here has never been easy to carry, and sometimes it feels like the whole world is trying to take it from me." Rebecca's heart ached at his words, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "But why me?" she asked again. "Why did you ask me to marry you?" Quote. Caleb's eyes softened. "I watched you, Rebecca. I saw the way you fought for what was right, the way you stood up for your family when everyone else had turned their backs. I needed someone who understood what it meant to fight, to work for something that mattered. I chose you because I knew you would stand beside me, not because of what I have, but because of who you are. Because you're strong enough to carry this burden with me." Quote. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her like the cold mountain air outside. She didn't have the answers she had hoped for, but something had shifted between them. For the first time since she arrived at Winterhouse, she felt like Caleb was finally letting her see who he truly was. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something new, something fragile, something that might break or build depending on the choices they made next. Rebecca nodded slowly, her hand still resting in his. "I'm not sure I understand it all yet, Caleb," she said, her voice quieter now, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to stand with you if you're willing to stand with me." Caleb's expression softened, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "Then we'll face this together," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Quote. And for the first time since they had married, Rebecca felt the weight of the world shift slightly, as if they were no longer standing on opposite sides of it. The days began to feel less like a whirlwind and more like the steady rhythm of a life being built, one decision at a time. Rebecca and Caleb worked together on the land and within Winterhouse. The lodge, though grand and vast, was slowly becoming a place where she could see herself, not as an outsider, but as someone who had a stake in its future. Every time she looked out over the valley, it felt like a new chapter was unfolding before her, one that was more than just about surviving. It was about creating something that would last. Caleb continued to oversee the operations of Winterhouse, but now, Rebecca was more than just a bystander. He brought her into the decisions that affected the land, the timber, and even the workers who lived in the valley. They walked the mill road together, talking about wages, the upkeep of the cabins, and the safety of the workers. Each time they did, Rebecca felt a little more connected to him and to the life they were building. The servants began to treat her with a different respect as well, no longer as a newcomer, but as someone who had a voice in the workings of the lodge. They would offer her polite nods and quiet smiles when they passed, and sometimes Rebecca would find herself pausing in the hallways, listening to the murmurs of the other women who had worked at Winterhouse for years. They no longer viewed her with the same curiosity or judgment. She was one of them now. But even as the days stretched on and the rhythm of life settled in, there was still something that gnawed at her. Caleb had been honest with her about the weight of his family's legacy, but there were moments when she would catch him staring out over the valley, his face clouded with thought. He had promised her that they would face everything together, but at times, Rebecca felt like there was more he wasn't saying. One evening, after a long day of walking the land and speaking with the foreman, they returned to Winterhouse just as the last light of the day faded behind the peaks. Caleb was quiet, more so than usual. He took a seat in front of the fire, staring into the flames, his jaw clenched with unspoken thoughts. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, standing at the door to the great room, unsure whether to disturb him. But she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had promised herself that she wouldn't retreat into the shadows again, not with Caleb, not with anyone. "Caleb," she said softly, stepping into the room. "What's on your mind?" Quote. He didn't turn right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, his fingers tapping against the arm of his chair. "I've been thinking about the future," he said quietly. "About what comes next. We've built something here, something strong, but there are forces at play, things I can't control." Rebecca moved closer, sitting beside him. "What forces?" "What are you talking about?" Quote. He looked at her then, his blue eyes tired, and for the first time she saw the weight of his burdens in them. Deep, quiet struggles that he had carried long before she came into his life. "The board," he muttered, his voice tight. "They're pushing for more timber, more expansion. They want to clear more land, cut faster, make more money. It's what they see as the future, but it's not the kind of future I want. I've been fighting them for years, but the pressure is only getting worse." Rebecca's heart sank as she listened, the quiet tension in his voice pulling her closer. She knew that Caleb's strength came not just from his hands or the land, but from his belief in what Winterhouse stood for. A place of lasting value, not just wealth. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "You've been carrying this on your own, haven't you?" Quote. Caleb nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't want to drag you into it. I wanted you to have a choice, to feel like you could stand beside me because you wanted to, not because you were forced to deal with the politics of Winterhouse." Quote. Rebecca reached out, her hand finding his, her fingers wrapping around his calloused palm. "I'm here, Caleb," she said firmly. "I've always been here. You don't have to carry this alone." He looked at her then, his eyes softening, and, for a moment, it was as if the weight of the world had lifted just a little. She had come to him, not as a wife in a grand house, but as a partner, someone who understood the land, who understood the fight he had been facing all along. "Thank you," he whispered, squeezing her hand. "I needed to hear that." The next morning, Rebecca awoke early, the light just beginning to filter through the high windows of their bedroom. Caleb was already gone, as he often was, to deal with the business of the lodge, the day's tasks stretching ahead of him. She sat up, stretching her arms, and for the first time something felt different. Something had shifted between them. The house felt less like a gilded cage and more like a place where they could build their own future together, not dictated by anyone else. Caleb had opened up to her, and in turn, she had found her place beside him. The fight ahead was theirs to share, and Rebecca knew she was ready for it. After a quick breakfast, she made her way down to the mill road. Caleb had mentioned a few concerns with the workers that needed her attention, and she knew it was time for her to step into the role he had envisioned for her when he first asked her to marry him. The day was cold, but the wind was calm, and the landscape ahead stretched out, vast and untouched, just waiting for them to shape it together. Rebecca's footsteps were steady as she made her way to the mill. The workers greeted her with nods, their faces still curious, but no longer judgmental. She had earned their respect, and with every day that passed, that respect grew stronger. As she walked through the familiar path that led to the mill, she saw Caleb at the far end, talking with the foreman. His voice was low, but she could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had drawn her to him in the first place. When he saw her, his face softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. He crossed the distance between them quickly, taking her hand in his. "How are we looking today?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, a confidence that hadn't been there before. Caleb smiled, a rare, genuine smile that made something warm bloom inside her chest. "Better," he said. "Better because you're here." Rebecca squeezed his hand, looking around at the men working, the land stretching beyond them. She had come to Winterhouse as a stranger to this life. But now, it was her life too. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and struggles, but it was theirs to shape. And together, they would fight to protect it. For the first time, Rebecca felt the weight of her choice, not as a burden, but as a shared promise. She had married Caleb to save her family, but now she was building something far more valuable. A partnership that could withstand whatever storms came their way. The winter months settled over Winter Ridge, bringing with them a biting cold and the promise of more challenges. The days grew shorter and the nights longer, but inside Winterhouse there was a warmth that hadn't been there before. The fire crackled in the hearth, the light from the lamps soft against the dark, heavy wood of the lodge. Rebecca and Caleb had settled into a routine, a rhythm that felt more like home with each passing day. Yet, even as they worked side by side, the threat of the board's pressure loomed over them like a storm gathering on the horizon. Caleb's fight to protect the land, to slow the pace of greed and destruction, was far from over. He had his allies, but even those were beginning to weaken as the stakes grew higher. Rebecca felt the weight of it all, the responsibility of their future, the pressure to prove that Winterhouse could be more than just a place of timber and wealth, but a place that stood for something enduring. One afternoon, as they sat together at the large table in the great room, Caleb slid a piece of paper across to Rebecca. It was a proposal from the board, an offer to buy out Winter Ridge to clear the land for new timber and expansion into the growing market. The offer was tempting, too tempting for many to ignore. The board members saw only the money, the profit to be made from selling out, and they pushed Caleb harder with each passing day. Rebecca's eyes scanned the letter, the words blurring together as the reality of what this meant settled in her chest. They were asking him to let go of the one thing he had fought for, to sacrifice his vision for the sake of profit. It was a choice that could change everything. She looked up from the paper, meeting Caleb's gaze. His face was set, a deep furrow between his brows, and his jaw clenched as if he were trying to hold something back. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly, her voice steady but filled with concern. Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the fire poker, stirring the embers in the hearth, his gaze distant. "I don't know if I can keep fighting, Rebecca," he said finally, his voice low, the weight of his words heavy in the room. "I'm not sure how much longer I can hold this all together. The board's pressure is relentless. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Rebecca set the letter aside and stood up, walking toward him. Her heart ached for him, for the man who had carried this burden alone for so long. He had always been strong, but even strength had its limits. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said, her voice firm as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can face this together. You don't have to give up your dream for Winter Ridge. Not if we fight for it." Quote. Caleb turned to face her, his eyes searching hers as if looking for something, perhaps the same hope she had seen in him when they first met. "I don't know if I can do it," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been carrying this for so long. I don't want to lose everything." Rebecca stepped closer, her heart beating faster. "You won't lose it," she said, her voice unwavering. "We've come this far, Caleb. We've built something here, something worth fighting for. And we have each other. I'm not going anywhere." He met her gaze, and for a moment it was as if the world outside had disappeared. There was only the two of them. Two people who had chosen each other, despite all the odds, despite the secrets and the weight of the world pressing down on them. Together they could face anything. "I won't let you down," Caleb said softly, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "We'll fight this together. We'll make sure Winter Ridge stands for something more than just timber and wealth. We'll make it something that lasts." The decision was made. They would stand against the board, together. Caleb began drafting a new proposal, one that would emphasize sustainability, responsible timber harvesting, and a focus on the future of the valley. Rebecca worked by his side, organizing the records and gathering support from the local workers and families who depended on Winter Ridge for their livelihoods. As the days passed, they spoke to every member of the board, presenting their vision for the future of Winter Ridge, a future that could still bring wealth, but not at the cost of the land they had come to love. The battle was long and hard, but they didn't waver. And in the end, the board reluctantly agreed to their terms, allowing them to maintain control of Winter Ridge, to preserve it for generations to come. The victory was bittersweet. There were still many challenges ahead: bills to pay, workers to care for, land to cultivate, but for the first time, Rebecca felt the weight of their shared purpose. Winter Ridge was theirs, and with Caleb by her side, she knew they could face whatever storms came their way. Months later, as the spring thaw began to melt the snow on the peaks of the mountains, Rebecca stood on the wide front porch of Winterhouse, watching the land stretch out before her. The valley was alive again, the river running clear and strong, the trees beginning to bud with new growth. The winds were soft, the air clean, and the promise of a new season filled her heart with hope. Caleb came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. He didn't speak, but the quiet contentment in his gaze said everything. They had fought for this, together, and now they could begin to build the future they had always dreamed of, one that was not defined by wealth, but by the strength of their love and the land they had chosen to protect. Rebecca leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. They had come a long way since that first night she had stepped into Winterhouse, uncertain of everything that lay ahead. Now, as she looked out over the valley, she knew she had found her place, by Caleb's side, in a world they had built together. A world that would stand, strong and enduring, for as long as the mountains themselves. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories that will touch your soul. See you in the next tale, partner.